Hi, thanks for joining me. In this video, I'm just going to be breaking down the current heads-up display within Marvel's Spider-Man 2. I've spent a good amount of time with this game, probably about 120 hours over multiple playthroughs. It's probably my favourite game of 2023, although one thing I have always had an issue with is the heads-up display, and it's because I feel like it's always impeded on the gameplay experience. So let's take a look at a couple of the elements now. So first of all, the heads-up display is hidden by default in free roam. This is a really good option to have. Besides the minimap, which is constantly on, this really makes the traverse a lot more cinematic. It only turns on once you've engaged in combat, or if you start interacting with these abilities, for example, shooting a web, as I'll be doing throughout this video. Speaking of the minimap, one thing that I'd like to talk about is how I'm not sure about the inclusion of a minimap in a third-person open-world game. Now, the minimap does come useful to people who are playing first-person shooters, in which you've got a kind of a small sandbox arena and enemy players who you might want to keep track on some sort of awareness. For example, if they fire their guns, they might show up. But in an open world game where most of the time you're not engaging in combat, for example Spider-Man, I'm not sure if the inclusion of a heads-up display is entirely necessary. Moving on to the next element, we'll be looking at the actual heads-up display when you're in combat. So what I'll stick out first of all is how many things are on screen. This is nowhere near as bad as some games get. There are some games that are a lot worse than this, which I'll provide examples of in my sketchbook. But there are still a lot of things going on the screen all the time, which I think probably could be simplified a little bit. So breaking down the individual elements, we'll start from the top left. So you have the health bar, the combo counter, and the focus bar. The health bar is an indicator of how much health you have. As you can see, in this current moment, Spider-Man's taking some damage, which you can kind of see reflected in his suit. So his health bar is about halfway. The maximum health is 200. This does change as you go throughout the game. You start off with about 100 health, and with upgrades you can get all the way up to 200. So it is nice to have a number there, although maybe not exactly necessary. The next thing we'll be looking at is the combo counter. Now, in combat, when you're dealing successive hits on enemies, the combo counter kind of builds up and counts each hit. There's no actual gameplay benefit of keeping track of how much damage you've done. It's more of a challenge thing where it's how long can you go in a fighting scenario without getting hit. And you have to do this quite quickly, otherwise it'll reset. So there are no real issues with that part of the heads-up display. It's in a good position and it's not taking up too much space for what it actually does. Moving on to the focus bar, this bit of the screen indicates focus, which is kind of a separate metric that can be used to either heal or deal damage. And what I mean by deal damage is execute a finishing move. So there's kind of a risk-reward element to it. Currently I've got 3, as you can see on screen. Now the reason I have 3 is because of the upgrades. You originally just start with 1, but it is important to see how much progress you made here because it kind of gives you an indication of when your next heal or finishing move will be, and that reflects, on how your gameplay is going so far. So with that covered, we'll look at the web section, which is in the top right. Here you also have the ultimate bar, but starting with webs, as you can see, every time I dispense a web, the count goes down 1 and it begins to recharge. There is some really good sound design and haptics to go alongside this. So if I dispense all the webs, you get this sound of the web shooter kind of being depleted. And then this begins to recharge slowly, and you're penalised for just consistently shooting webs. So in a way, you're incentivized to kind of let it all build up and then using as many as you can. I didn't use this part of the heads-up display throughout most of my playthrough, and I think that's a shared experience with most players, mainly because it's not that important to keep track of how many webs you have, but also because it's kind of a difficult area to look at, mainly because it's really small. And because of the height of the screen, if you put the horizon in the middle where it normally is, this kind of becomes a really difficult space to look at. There's not much contrast between this and the backgrounds, which makes it so most of the time it's more effort than it's worth to try and keep track of how many webs you actually have. Then you have the ultimate bar, which is not offensive in any way whatsoever. Once you use it, it just starts depleting and it goes red as it's about to run out. So the main elements of the heads-up display that I'd like to tackle in the redesign are in the middle, at the bottom of the screen. There's one on the right and the left, which you can see as these kind of wheels with 4 different elements on them. One being represented on the left with the left bumper, which if you hold, you get this really nice sound. And the right bumper, which does the same thing. Now, the difference visually when you hold it isn't big enough really for me to say that it's a good feature to have, although the idea here is really good. What you use these for is to assign kind of abilities or web gadgets with left or right respectively to your standard buttons. So for example, in combat, square is your attack button for close range attacks. But if you hold L1, now where square is, you use that ability or that gadget. So this is a really good way of kind of giving the player a lot more autonomy over what moves they're going to control. You can see here that there's this kind of, on the left bumper, you have this recharge state, and you don't have that for the web gadgets as much. And it's because you don't earn these back. You kind of just get these through combat occasionally. When you defeat an enemy, there's a chance that you'll get one of these web gadgets back. Whereas the abilities on the left, those actually are recharged slowly. Now, these aren't necessarily timed. They're just kind of built up throughout combat. So in a way, there's no real way of controlling how you're going to recharge these and when you'll get them back. And it's because of that, I think that the recharge kind of visibility, whilst interesting, isn't necessarily helpful because it doesn't really affect how the player is going to do their combat. Because of this, I think in my heads-up display, I'll probably make this a less important feature and instead focus on clarity most of the time and show this kind of information when you do bring the heads-up display up to full screen. So overall, the heads-up display isn't entirely problematic. There's not too much going on with it, but there definitely is room for improvement. And you can see this when you're looking at the Spider-Man subreddit.
Hello, this is Harris from the future editing the video. So one thing I did forget to mention is that I did have a kind of brief playthrough of the game without the heads-up display on. And I did this mainly just to see how I would fare without all the extra information that's presented to me throughout the heads-up display. And what I noticed is that whilst it is really useful, and there definitely is some key information on there, it's not entirely necessary, and you can definitely make do without it. And this is a good find because it kind of provides a good baseline for me to start, where now all the information that I'll be adding is kind of supplementary to improve the experience, instead of the approach that I think Insomniac might have taken, which is let's give as much as we can, and the rest of the stuff that maybe isn't as important we'll kind of take away or minimize it or make it look smaller. Another element that might be worth mentioning is that the game has a really good gradual tutorial system scattered throughout the first 2 hours of gameplay and across 5 missions. So by the time the player gets to about the 3-hour mark, they're pretty well acquainted with the controls already and the different systems. Because of this, I don't think it's entirely necessary to keep the controls on the screen all the time.